Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling a really significant question. It's all about artificial intelligence, the increasing automation we're seeing, and what that could potentially mean for jobs.
Yeah, it's a huge topic right now.
And the big idea that keeps popping up in this conversation is universal basic income, or UBI. Is it actually a realistic way to handle a future where AI might take over a lot of jobs?
It's definitely become a central point of discussion, hasn't it? As we look at the potential future of work, the thinking goes, if AI gets really good at doing tasks humans do now, well, we might need a fundamental shift in how people earn a living.
Right.
And UBI is often put forward as maybe the answer to that challenge.
Exactly. You often hear it framed that way. AI comes in, automation really changes the game for jobs, and UBI is this safety net that catches everyone. Maybe it even frees people up for other things.
That's the optimistic view, certainly.
But today, we really want to dig into the details. We've looked at quite a bit of research, and the core question we're asking is this. If AI does cause really widespread job losses, is UBI at a level that could genuinely support, say, a middle-class life? Is that actually practical?
That's the critical lens we need, I think. It's one thing to talk about UBI as a concept, but when you start looking at the sheer scale of job displacement AI could bring, and then you factor in the actual cost of providing a meaningful income to, maybe half the population, well, the situation gets a whole lot more complex.
Okay, let's start there then, the scale. How many jobs are we potentially talking about being affected? You sometimes hear these really high numbers, like 50% or even more jobs disappearing because of AI. Based on the research, is that a plausible scenario to even consider?
Well, 50% job elimination is certainly a dramatic figure, but the trend towards automation is definitely real. McKinsey and Company, for example, they've estimated that roughly half of the tasks currently done in the workplace could potentially be automated using technologies we already have.
Half the tasks? Okay. Not necessarily half the jobs disappearing entirely, then.
Not necessarily translating directly one-to-one, no. But Oxford University did research suggesting around 47% of U.S. jobs are at high risk of automation in the next couple of decades. So the potential impact is substantial.
And it's not just the sort of traditional manual labor jobs anymore, is it? That feels like a key difference this time around.
Exactly. That's a crucial point. The World Economic Forum has highlighted this. AI is now capable of automating many white-collar, even entry-level positions.
Right. The kinds of jobs maybe we thought were safer.
Potentially. They even suggest AI might automate as many jobs as it creates overall. And their 2025 Future of Jobs report found that about 40% of employers actually expect to reduce their workforce specifically because of AI automation.
40% expecting to reduce workforce size. That's significant.
Yeah.
So even if we don't hit a full 50% net job loss, because maybe new jobs are created too.
Which is a possibility, yes.
We're still potentially looking at a huge amount of disruption. It seems like the whole reason we're seriously discussing UBI as a primary response is this possibility of just massive, maybe long-term unemployment.
That really is the core argument for UBI in this context.
Yeah.
The idea is, look, if our usual ways of adapting, like creating new types of jobs or retraining people, simply can't keep up with how fast and wide AI automation might spread, then maybe a universal basic income becomes a necessary foundation just to ensure some economic stability for a very large part of society.
Okay, let's run with that assumption for a bit. Significant job displacement happens. What kind of UBI level are we even talking about? If the goal is to maintain what people generally think of as a middle-class standard of living here in the U.S., it strikes me that middle class itself is a pretty slippery concept.
You've hit on a really complex issue straight away. Defining middle class in a country as diverse economically and geographically as the U.S. is, well, it's a huge challenge. Pew Research, for instance, they define middle income as households earning between 2/3 and double the national median income.
Which already gives you a pretty wide band.
It does. And then you layer on top of that the actual cost of living in different places. It gets even more complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Absolutely. If you look at, say, 2023 data from Smart Asset, the lower end of what was considered middle-class income in Mississippi was around $36,000 a year. In Massachusetts, though, it was almost double that.
Wow, quite a difference.
And then you look at really high-cost cities like Arlington, Virginia, the range goes even higher. But somewhere like Detroit, the range would be lower. So trying to pick one single UBI number that works as middle class everywhere, that's a fundamental problem.
So a flat nationwide UBI payment might actually create its own inequalities, just based on where you live.
That's a very real possibility, yeah. A payment that's comfortable in one area could leave someone really struggling somewhere else.
Okay, but just to try and get a handle on the sheer cost, can we use some national averages as a sort of rough guide? What were median incomes looking like recently?
We can use them as a starting point, sure. Projections for the median individual salary in the U.S. around 2025 are somewhere near $62,000. And the median household income in large cities in 2023 was about $74,000. So these give us some ballpark figures if the aim is a UBI, approximating that kind of middle class level.
Right, so let's try and put some numbers on this just to understand the scale. Let's use that hypothetical scenario again. Maybe half the adult population needs UBI. That's roughly, what, 113 million people?
Based on 2025 estimates, yeah, around 112.9 or 113 million adults.
Okay, so what kind of annual price tag are we looking at if each of those 113 million people got, say, $30,000 a year?
All right, let's run those numbers. At $30,000 per recipient for 113 million people, you're looking at roughly $3.4 trillion per year.
$3.4 trillion.
Annually. And if you aimed higher, say $50,000 per person, closer to that median salary idea,
Yeah.
the total cost jumps to about $5.65 trillion a year.
Okay, and what if we aimed even higher, closer to that median household figure for big cities, say $60,000?
At $60,000 per person, the annual cost would be around $6.78 trillion.
Those are just staggering numbers. How do they compare to the whole U.S. economy, the GDP, or current government spending?
They really are staggering. So in 2024, the U.S. GDP was about $28.8 trillion. That $3.4 trillion UBI at the lower end, that's almost 12% of the entire GDP.
12%.
The $5.65 trillion option is nearly 20% of GDP. And the $6.78 trillion one, over 23% of the entire economy's output.
And compared to what the government already spends?
Total federal spending in 2024 was around $6.75 trillion. So that $3.4 trillion UBI would increase federal spending by about 50%. The $5.65 trillion UBI would nearly double federal spending, and the $6.78 trillion version would more than double it. And it's crucial to remember, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, they're already projecting increases in federal spending and borrowing for 2025, even without adding a massive new program like UBI.
So, okay, this leads directly to the absolutely critical question. Where on earth would this money come from? It can't just appear out of thin air. The idea you hear most offers, well, just tax all the wealth being generated by AI and automation. How feasible is that?
This is where that seemingly simple solution starts to unravel a bit. Our current tax system, here in the U.S. anyway, relies really heavily on individual income taxes and payroll taxes, right? Things tied directly to people having jobs. If you're in a situation where, say, half the workforce isn't working anymore because of AI, the tax base that currently funds a huge chunk of government spending just gets dramatically smaller. The very problem that makes UBI seem necessary also undermines how we traditionally pay for things.
Right. The source dries up just when you need it most. But what about specifically targeting those AI windfalls you hear about? Taxing the companies making huge profits from automation. It sounds logical.
It does sound logical on the surface, but there are some major practical problems. First, how do you accurately figure out which part of a company's profit comes only from AI versus, good management, existing patents, market share, all the other stuff? It's incredibly difficult to isolate.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Second, AI development is global. Big companies do R&D here, deploy systems there, use data from somewhere else. Which country actually gets to tax those profits? It gets very messy very quickly.
International tax issues, right.
And third, if you tax AI profits too heavily or in a way that seems unfair or unpredictable, you risk companies just leaving or investing less in AI here. They might move their AI work, their patents to countries with lower taxes. That's capital flight.
So taxing the robots isn't quite as simple as it sounds. What about just taxing the UBI payments themselves? Couldn't that claw back some of the cost?
That's a really important point, and it trips people up sometimes.
Yeah.
If UBI is the main or only income for millions of people because they aren't employed, then taxing that UBI doesn't actually generate new money for the program overall. It's like the government gives you money with one hand and immediately takes some back with the other. The entire initial gross cost of giving UBI to everyone who isn't earning otherwise still has to be funded from somewhere else.
From taxes on people still working or on companies or consumption.
Exactly. Taxes on the employed, corporate profits, maybe sales taxes, VAT, something like that.
Which brings us back to some very tough choices, doesn't it? You either have to massively hike existing taxes or create entirely new ones. What are the likely consequences if you tried to fund that, say, $3.4 trillion UBI through those kinds of traditional taxes?
Well, if you tried to get it all from income taxes on the remaining half of the workforce, you'd probably need gigantic increases in tax rates. That could really discourage people from working or investing, potentially making the economy smaller overall.
Or a shrinking pie?
Potentially. If you tried hitting corporate taxes much harder, again, you risk companies investing less, moving profits or operations overseas to avoid the tax burden. And a big national sales tax, or VAT, that could raise a lot of money, sure, but it tends to hit lower-income people hardest, including the ones relying on UBI, because they spend a bigger chunk of their income on basic goods. It's regressive.
You crunched some numbers on what kind of tax hikes might be needed just for that $3.4 trillion UBI, didn't you?
Yeah, just as illustrations. To get an extra $3.4 trillion just from personal income taxes would mean roughly a 140% increase in the total income tax collected each year. And that's assuming the tax base, the employed people, doesn't shrink because of the high rates, which is optimistic.
140% increase. Okay, what about corporate taxes?
Relying only on corporate taxes, you'd need something like a 1,300% increase in revenue from that source. It's almost unimaginable.
Wow. And a new consumption tax.
Even a new federal consumption tax, like a VAT, would probably need to be somewhere in the 20% to 25% range to raise that much money. And remember, that would be on top of existing state and local sales taxes. It would make everything significantly more expensive.
Those kinds of increases sound, well, not just economically tricky, but politically almost impossible to imagine actually happening.
The political resistance would likely be overwhelming, yes.
And it's not just the direct cost or the tax mechanics, right? There are bigger economic ripples to worry about, like inflation.
Absolutely. If you suddenly inject trillions of new dollars into the economy via UBI, but the amount of goods and services being produced hasn't increased, especially if half the workforce isn't producing in the traditional sense, you could easily trigger significant inflation.
Which would just eat away at the value of the UBI payment.
Exactly. It could defeat the whole purpose. Then there are the ongoing debates about incentives. How would a guaranteed income affect people's motivation to work or learn new skills? The evidence from small UBI trials is kind of mixed on that, but it's a valid concern at scale.
Right.
The main worry is that if you fund UBI through taxes that massively distort the economy, you could end up making society worse off overall, even if you've put a basic income floor in place.
Okay, so the domestic hurdles, the sheer cost, the funding mechanisms, the potential economic distortion seem enormous. But what about looking globally? AI development, the wealth it creates, that's not evenly spread out, is it?
No, definitely not. It's highly concentrated. Right now, the US and China are really the dominant players in AI development and attracting investment.
They have most of the big companies, the funding.
Exactly. The US has a huge number of leading AI firms, massive private investment. China is a very strong second. This concentration means that the bulk of the profits, the productivity gains from AI, are probably going to accumulate mostly within those two ecosystems.
Which makes the idea of some kind of global AI profit sharing to fund UBI everywhere else seem difficult.
It makes it seem very difficult, yes. The idea that the leading AI nations would voluntarily share a huge chunk of their AI wealth to fund UBI in other countries, that runs right up against national economic interests and fierce global competition.
Especially with the US-China rivalry in AI.
Precisely. Both countries are focused on gaining their own economic edge, their own tech leadership. If one country unilaterally decided to impose really high taxes on its AI companies to fund global UBI, they'd risk those companies just moving somewhere else, that capital flight issue again. Plus, getting all countries to agree on complex international tax rules is historically incredibly hard.
We see that already with existing tax coordination efforts.
Exactly. Even things like the OECD's BEPS framework aimed at tackling corporate tax avoidance face huge challenges.
And isn't there also a risk that AI could actually widen the gap between rich and poor countries?
Yes, that's a major concern. The IMF, for instance, has suggested AI benefits will likely flow disproportionately to advanced economies. They have the infrastructure, the skilled workforce, the massive data sets needed to really leverage AI.
While developing countries might fall further behind.
Potentially. The World Bank notes that while AI's impact might hit developing labor markets more slowly at first, it could definitely widen the overall economic and tech gap in the longer run. And our current global rules around intellectual property tend to keep the wealth from AI innovations concentrated in corporations based in developed nations.
So this idea of AI-rich nations funding big UBI programs elsewhere seems pretty unlikely given all that. You mentioned a possible perverse scenario, though. What did you mean by that?
Well, the concern is this. Imagine AI causes significant job displacement within a wealthy nation like the US. There might be intense domestic pressure to implement UBI there.
Okay.
How might they fund it? One way could be by taxing the global profits of their AI companies, including profits made from selling AI services to or using data from developing countries.
So the wealth generated partly from poorer countries could end up funding UBI only in the richer ones.
It's a possibility. It could inadvertently become a new form of sort of digital resource extraction, where the benefits flow one way and aren't really redistributed back globally in a meaningful way.
That paints a pretty grim picture for a globally funded UBI being the simple answer.
Hmm.
Let's step back even further. You brought up some historical context, referencing Walter Scheidl's work on inequality. What does history tell us about the kind of massive wealth shift needed for a middle-class UBI?
Scheidl's work, The Great Leveler, is quite stark. His analysis of centuries of history suggests that major, lasting reductions in economic inequality haven't typically come from peaceful reforms or gradual economic growth.
No. What caused them then?
They've mostly been driven by what he calls the Four Horsemen, massive violent shocks. Things like major wars, transformative revolutions, state collapse, or catastrophic pandemics. These events fundamentally disrupted existing power structures and property relations.
So gradual change doesn't usually cut it for big reductions in inequality.
His research suggests not, on a grand scale. And while AI causing mass job loss would be a huge disruption, it doesn't automatically fit that pattern of violent shock that historically led to major leveling. It doesn't inherently guarantee the kind of fundamental redistribution of wealth needed to fund a truly comprehensive middle-class level UBI within our current system.
So UBI within our current capitalist structure might be more like a bandage than a cure.
You could see it that way. Within a system where private ownership of the means of production, including increasingly powerful AI, remains the norm, UBI is essentially a transfer payment. It can definitely help reduce poverty, provide a safety net, absolutely, but it doesn't fundamentally change how wealth is generated and where it accumulates initially.
So for UBI to be truly transformative in an AI future, you'd need more than just the payments.
It seems likely. You'd probably need much deeper structural changes, maybe rethinking ownership of AI, control over the technology, things that go way beyond just income transfers. You also drew a parallel to some assumptions in historical communism. Can you elaborate on that connection? It wasn't about ideology, right?
No, not about ideology or political values. It was more about a shared, perhaps optimistic assumption about technology and distribution. Both the idea of an AI-funded UBI utopia and some historical communist theories seem to assume that technological abundance automatically leads to mass liberation, and that some large-scale coordination state planning or global taxation can efficiently and fairly distribute that abundance.
And history suggests that kind of top-down coordination is harder than it looks.
History suggests it often runs into its own problems, yeah. Unintended consequences, inefficiencies, potential for new forms of control.
So UBI might provide stability, but it doesn't necessarily tackle the core issue of who owns and controls the AI that's generating the wealth.
Exactly. That's a crucial point. You could even argue that UBI on its own might inadvertently legitimize a system where a small group controls the incredibly productive AI, and the majority becomes dependent on state transfers, however adequate or inadequate those transfers might be. So the focus on UBI might distract from that deeper question of ownership.
It potentially could, yes. A truly equitable future with advanced AI might require us to seriously rethink ownership models for that core AI infrastructure. Maybe more public ownership, collective ownership models. Focusing only on UBI lets us sidestep those really fundamental questions about who controls the source of wealth and power. And there's another angle, too.
What's that?
If large numbers of people are no longer workers in the traditional sense, their political power to demand a high and sustained UBI through traditional labor movements or collective bargaining might actually be weaker.
That's an interesting point. Less leverage.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway here?
Yeah.
UBI as the big fix for AI job displacement, feasible or not?
I think the central conclusion, looking at the fiscal, structural, and geopolitical realities, is that UBI as a standalone solution designed to give everyone a middle-class living standard after mass AI job loss, well, it just doesn't look practically viable under our current global systems.
The numbers don't add up. The politics are incredibly difficult. The global cooperation isn't there.
Pretty much. It faces huge hurdles fiscally, it doesn't fit well with how our tax systems work now, and it seems very unlikely from a geopolitical perspective.
So it sounds like you're saying the challenge AI poses is actually much deeper. It requires more fundamental changes than just sending out checks.
I think that's what the limitations of UBI really highlight, yes. The sheer difficulty of making UBI work on the scale potentially required underscores just how transformative AI might be. Dealing with its impacts effectively probably requires a much bigger rethink.
A rethink of what, specifically?
Of global structures, really. Fundamental questions about who owns AI, what kinds of international agreements we met, what the social contract even looks like when intelligent machines do much of the work.
So the UBI debate, even if UBI itself isn't the ultimate answer.
Exactly. Even if it's not the simple panacea, the difficulty of implementing it forces us to confront these much bigger, more fundamental questions about our economic and political structures in the face of this technology. It might be the catalyst we need for that deeper conversation.
Which presents us with a pretty stark choice then, doesn't it? Either face potentially massive societal problems from AI displacement or start seriously considering some very deep structural changes.
That seems to be the choice the AI revolution might be forcing upon us. The myth of UBI as an easy fix might actually push us towards grappling with the true scale of the transformation ahead.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.